The shrill voice carried over the fence like an air raid siren, piercing the tranquil Saturday afternoon that Mark Reynolds had been enjoying in his backyard pool. He froze mid-stroke, water dripping from his beer as he turned toward the sound. "Excuse me. Excuse-me? What do you think you're doing?" Mark treaded water, squinting against the sun to make out the figure now leaning precariously over his 6-foot privacy fence. A woman with a geometric blonde haircut that seemed to defy both gravity and fashion stood there, her hands firmly planted on her hips, face contorted into what could only be described as professional outrage. "I'm swimming," Mark replied flatly, "in my pool, on my property." He had moved into the Oak Ridge subdivision just 3 weeks ago, and this was the first time he'd had the chance to properly enjoy the small but pristine in-ground pool that had been the selling point of the modestly priced home. At 42, recently divorced and starting over in a new city, Mark had been looking forward to this moment of peace. "This is a family neighborhood," the woman snapped, her voice carrying so loudly that Mark was certain everyone within a 3-house radius could hear. "There are children who'd see you." Mark looked down at himself, confused. He was wearing swim trunks. Standard, boring, middle-aged man's swim trunks. "I'm fully clothed, ma'am," he said, trying to keep his tone neutral. "And I'm in my own backyard." "That's not the point." The woman's face flushed red, clashing with her pink blouse. "Your pool isn't properly registered with the HOA. I don't see a permit displayed anywhere. And according to the bylaws, Section 5, Paragraph 3, all recreational water features must be." "I don't belong to an HOA." Mark interrupted, swimming to the ladder and climbing out. He grabbed a towel from a nearby chair and dried his face. "This section of Oak Ridge doesn't have one. I specifically checked before buying." The woman's mouth opened and closed several times like a fish suddenly finding itself on dry land. That's impossible. The entire neighborhood is governed by." "Not this block," Mark said firmly, wrapping the towel around his shoulders. "The developer sold these 8 houses separately before the HOA was established. We're grandfathered out." "Well, that doesn't mean you can just do whatever you want." She was practically vibrating with indignation now. "I'm Diane Holloway, head of the Neighborhood Watch and vice president of the Oak Ridge Community Association. I have a responsibility to maintain standards." Mark had heard about Diane from his realtor and the one neighbor he'd met so far, a retired teacher named Ellis, who had warned him with a knowing look that Diane considers herself the unofficial mayor of Oak Ridge. Now he understood what Ellis had meant. "Ms. Holloway, I appreciate your concern, but there's nothing illegal about having a pool or swimming in it. Now, if you'll excuse me." "I've already documented multiple violations," Diane cut in, holding up her phone. Mark realized with a jolt that she was taking pictures of his yard, of him. "Undocumented water feature, excessive noise, possible public indecency." "You're photographing me without permission?" Mark's patience evaporated. "And there's nothing indecent happening here. Please stop taking pictures of my property and me right now." Diane's thin lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear, Mr. Reynolds, Mark Reynolds, and I'm going to have to ask you to leave my property line now." "Oh, I'm not on your property. I'm on the public easement. You're leaning over my fence taking photographs without consent. That's invasion of privacy." Diane's smile only widened. "We'll see what the authorities have to say about that, and about your unauthorized pool." As she disappeared from view, Mark heard her already on the phone, her voice carried on the breeze. "Yes, I'd like to report a code violation and possible indecent exposure." Mark stood dripping beside his pool, towel clutched in white-knuckled hands as he tried to process what had just happened. He'd moved to Oak Ridge specifically for its quiet reputation and affordable homes, not to be harassed while trying to enjoy a simple swim. He was debating whether to continue his afternoon or retreat inside when he heard a gentle knock on his back gate. "Hello, Mr. Reynolds." The voice was warm and apologetic, nothing like Diane's strident tones. Mark cautiously approached the gate and peered over. A woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair and gardening gloves stood there, looking embarrassed. "I'm Helen Patel from next door," she said, gesturing to the blue house to the left. "I couldn't help overhearing. I wanted to apologize for Diane. She doesn't speak for all of us." Mark unlatched the gate. "Nice to meet you, though I wish it were under better circumstances. Diane's been worse since they didn't elect her HOA president last year," Helen explained, shaking her head. "She's convinced your block is somehow under her jurisdiction, despite all evidence to the contrary." "Has she actually called the authorities on neighbors before?" Mark asked, his stomach sinking. Helen's expression said it all. 3 times last month alone. The police know her by name now. Usually, they just humor her, but this time she's claiming I'm some kind of pervert exposing myself in my own backyard. Mark finished grimly. "She's been trying to get the city to force your section to join the HOA for years," Helen said. Your pool is just her latest crusade. The previous owner of your house took down a beautiful old oak tree, and you think he committed murder the way she carried on." Mark was about to respond when the doorbell rang. His heart sank. "That'll be the police," Helen murmured. "Want me to come with you? I've dealt with this before." Mark nodded gratefully. "Please." As they rounded the side of the house, Mark could see two officers standing on his front porch. One was a tall black woman with her hair pulled back tightly, her expression professional but weary. The younger officer beside her looked barely out of the academy. Standing a few feet away, arms crossed triumphantly, was Diane Holloway. "Mr. Reynolds?" the female officer asked as they approached. "Yes, that's me. And this is my neighbor, Helen Petal." "I'm Officer Washington. This is Officer Chen. We received a call about some neighborhood concerns," she said diplomatically, though her tone suggested this wasn't her first rodeo with these types of complaints. Before Mark could speak, Diane stepped forward. "He's operating an unauthorized swimming pool without proper permits or safety fencing," she declared, thrusting her phone forward to show the photos she'd taken, and he was exposing himself where children could potentially see. "I was swimming in regular swim trunks in my fenced backyard," Mark countered evenly. "Ms. Holloway took photographs of me without permission by leaning over my privacy fence." Officer Washington's gaze shifted between them. "Ms. Holloway, did you enter this property or reach over the fence line?" "I was simply documenting violations for the Homeowners Association," Diane replied, chin lifted. "As the vice president, it's my responsibility too." "His property isn't part of your HOA," Helen interrupted. "The whole block isn't, as you've been told repeatedly by the city." Officer Chen cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we checked the property records on our way over. This address is indeed not part of the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association." Diane's face flushed. "Well, that's a technicality. The spirit of the neighborhood standards don't apply to properties not in the association." Officer Washington finished firmly. "Ms. Holloway, taking photographs of someone in their private backyard without consent could potentially constitute harassment or invasion of privacy." "But the pool," Diane protested, "has all the required city permits," Mark interjected. "I made sure of that during the purchasing process. I have the documentation inside if you need to see it." Officer Washington shook her head. "That won't be necessary. Private pools require city permits, not HOA approval for non-HOA properties." She turned fully toward Diane now, her posture straightening. "Ms. Holloway, this is the fourth unfounded complaint call you've made this month." "Unfounded? This man is." "Swimming in his own backyard," Officer Chen said, his voice gaining confidence. "No laws are being broken here." "But, Ms. Holloway," Officer Washington cut in, her voice dropping a register. "We need to discuss the misuse of emergency services. Would you prefer to have that conversation here or back at the station?" The color drained from Diane's face as quickly as it had appeared. For perhaps the first time since Mark had encountered her, she seemed at a loss for words. From his porch, Mark caught Helen hiding a smile behind her hand, and he felt the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. The afternoon wasn't turning out how he planned, but somehow he had the feeling things were about to change in his new neighborhood. The following weekend arrived with perfect pool weather, clear blue skies, 85 degrees, and a gentle breeze that made the oak leaves dance at the edges of Mark's yard. After the confrontation with Diane, Mark had spent the week researching local ordinances and confirming his property rights. He'd even gone so far as to purchase a laminated copy of his pool permit and property boundary survey, which now hung discreetly but visibly on the inside of his fence. He was determined to enjoy his Saturday, Diane Holloway be damned. Mark had just settled onto his floating lounger, iced tea in the cup holder, and thriller novel in hand when Helen called over the fence. "Mark, got a minute?" He paddled to the edge of the pool. "Sure. What's up?" Helen appeared at the gate with a plate of homemade samosas. "Thought you might enjoy these, and I wanted to warn you, there's a neighborhood association meeting this afternoon." Mark accepted the plate gratefully. "Thanks for the food, but why would their meeting concern me?" "I'm not a member." Helen's eyes twinkled. "Because you're on the agenda. Item number 3, discussion of non-conforming properties and community standards enforcement." "You've got to be kidding me," Mark groaned. "Diane's been rallying her troops all week. I've never seen someone so determined to die on a hill that isn't even in her jurisdiction." Mark took a bite of a samosa and nearly moaned at the explosion of flavors. "These are incredible, Helen, and thanks for the heads up about the meeting." "It should come," Helen suggested, surprising him. "It's at the community center at 3. You have every right to be there. They can't stop non-HOA members from attending." Mark considered it. He planned a peaceful day of swimming and reading, not confrontation. But the idea of Diane discussing him and his property behind his back rankled. "I might just do that," he said finally. The Oak Ridge Community Center was packed when Mark arrived at 3 o'clock sharp. He recognized a few faces from his street, including Ellis, the retired teacher, who gave him a subtle thumbs up from across the room. Most people, however, were strangers, clustered in small groups and speaking in hushed tones that fell silent as he entered. Diane sat at a table at the front, alongside 4 other board members. Her eyes widened when she spotted him, and she leaned over to whisper urgently to a balding man next to her. Mark took a seat in the back row next to Helen, who had saved him a place. "That's Gerald Henderson, the HOA president," she whispered, nodding toward the balding man. "He's usually reasonable, but he lets Diane run wild because she handles all the tedious work no one else wants to do." The meeting began with standard business: approval of previous minutes, treasurer's report, and discussions about the community garden project. Mark sat quietly, observing the dynamics. Despite her title as vice president, Diane clearly ran the show, with Gerald deferring to her on most matters. Finally, they reached item 3. "Next agenda item," Gerald announced, consulting his notes. "Discussion of non-conforming properties and community standards enforcement, led by our vice president, Diane Holloway." Diane stood, smoothing her immaculate beige pantsuit. "Thank you, Gerald. As many of you know, we have a situation with the original 8 properties on Maple Street that are technically outside our association's jurisdiction." A slide appeared on the screen behind her, a satellite view of Mark's street, with the 8 non-HOA houses highlighted in red. Mark's house was circled. "These properties create inconsistency in our neighborhood standards," Diane continued. "Case in point, 1842 Maple Street has installed an unauthorized swimming pool without proper safety measures or aesthetic considerations." The next slide showed the photos she'd taken of Mark's yard, the same ones she'd shown the police. Murmurs rippled through the room. "I move that we petition the city council to require these properties to join our association for the safety and cohesion of our community," Diane concluded triumphantly. Mark had heard enough. He stood up. "Point of order," he called clearly. The room fell silent as all heads turned toward him. "Mr. Reynolds," Diane said icily, "while we welcome observers, only association members may speak during meetings." Actually came a new voice from the doorway. "Your own bylaws state that any community member affected by an agenda item has the right to address the board." Officer Washington stood in the entrance, dressed in civilian clothes but with an unmistakable authority in her bearing. "Lisa," Helen whispered to Mark. "She lives 3 streets over. I might have mentioned the meeting to her this morning." "Officer Washington," Gerald said with evident surprise. "Are you here in official capacity?" "Just as a concerned resident," she replied, taking a seat near the door. "But Mr. Reynolds is correct about his right to speak on this matter." Gerald looked uncomfortable, but nodded. The chair recognizes Mark Reynolds. Mark walked to the front of the room, feeling every eye upon him. He hadn't prepared a speech, but as he turned to face the crowd, he found he didn't need one. "My name is Mark Reynolds. I moved here because Oak Ridge seemed like a friendly, peaceful community. I purchased my home specifically because it wasn't subject to HOA restrictions, which was important to me after my divorce." He paused, letting that personal detail sink in. "My pool is fully permitted by the city with safety features that exceed local requirements. I have documentation to prove it." He held up his folder of permits. "What's happening here isn't about safety or community cohesion," he continued, his voice steady. "It's about control. Ms. Holloway trespassed on my property, photographed me without consent, and filed a false police report, all because I dared to use my own pool in my own backyard." The room had gone completely still. Even Diane seemed momentarily speechless. "I understand the value of community standards," Mark said, softening his tone. "But those standards should never come at the expense of respecting each other's legal rights and basic privacy. I'd be happy to discuss legitimate concerns with any neighbor, but that conversation needs to start with mutual respect, not surveillance and threats." As Mark returned to his seat, the silence broke into scattered applause led by Ellis and a few others. Gerald cleared his throat, looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. This is certainly a complex issue that perhaps requires further consideration before any action." Diane remained standing, her knuckles white against the edge of the table. For the first time since Mark had encountered her, she looked not angry, but afraid. Afraid of losing the tight grip she'd maintained on the neighborhood for so long. And in that moment, Mark knew the tide was turning. The following weeks brought an uneasy peace to Maple Street. Mark caught glimpses of Diane occasionally, power walking with her small group of loyalists, inspecting mailbox heights with a tape measure, or photographing a neighbor's unsanctioned wind chimes. But she gave his property a wide berth. The confrontation at the HOA meeting had created ripples throughout Oak Ridge, with neighbors from both HOA and non-HOA properties stopping by to introduce themselves to Mark, often with sympathy in their eyes and stories of their own Diane encounters on their lips. It was Ellis who brought the news one evening as Mark was trimming his hedges. "Thought you'd want to know," the retired teacher said, leaning against the fence with a knowing smile. "There's been a coup of sorts." Mark set down his clippers. "What kind of coup?" "Gerald called an emergency board meeting yesterday. Didn't invite Diane." Ellis's eyes twinkled. "Seems your little speech at the meeting opened some floodgates. 3 other homeowners filed formal complaints about her overreach, and someone circulated a petition about abuse of power that got 68 signatures." "You're kidding," Mark said, genuinely surprised. "I never intended to cause that kind of trouble." "You didn't cause it," Ellis corrected. "You just gave people the courage to speak up about what's been happening for years." The final straw was apparently when the city sent the HOA a formal warning about harassment after reviewing the incident report from when Diane called the police on you. Mark shook his head, still processing. "So what happens now?" "Gerald asked her to step down as vice president. She refused. So they're holding a special election next month." Ellis glanced over his shoulder and lowered his voice. "Between you and me, she doesn't stand a chance. Helen's running against her." The image of kind, samosa-bearing Helen replacing Diane as vice president made Mark smile. Wow. I don't know what to say." "Nothing to say," Ellis shrugged. "Justice has a way of working itself out sometimes." He straightened up from the fence. "Anyway, that's not why I came by. A few of us non-HOA folks are having a block party next Saturday. Thought you might want to join us. Bring your famous swimming skills." Mark laughed. "I'd like that." As Ellis walked away, Mark returned to his hedges, feeling lighter than he had in months. The divorce, the move, the confrontation, all of it had left him feeling isolated and defensive. Now, unexpectedly, he was finding community in the very place he least expected it. The following morning brought another surprise. Mark was making coffee when his doorbell rang. Opening the door, he found himself face to face with Diane Holloway. She wore a tailored navy dress and clutched her designer purse like a shield. Her face, usually animated with righteousness, looked stiff and drawn. "Mr. Reynolds," she said formally, "may I speak with you for a moment?" Mark hesitated, then stepped back to allow her inside. "Would you like some coffee?" "No, thank you." "This won't take long." She remained standing in his entryway, examining a spot on the wall just past his shoulder. "I've been advised by the HOA's legal counsel to formally apologize for my actions regarding your property and privacy." The words came out mechanical and rehearsed. Mark waited, saying nothing. "I acknowledge that I overstepped my authority and violated your privacy by photographing you and your property without consent," she continued. "And I regret making unfounded accusations to law enforcement." Mark studied her. There was no real remorse in her eyes, only the wounded pride of someone forced to apologize against their will. Still, he recognized the effort this must have cost her. "I appreciate the apology," he said simply. Diane nodded stiffly. "The photographs have been deleted, and I signed a statement confirming I will not approach your property again without invitation." "That sounds reasonable." An awkward silence stretched between them. Finally, Diane cleared her throat. "For what it's worth, Mr. Reynolds, I've lived in Oak Ridge for 26 years. I watched it grow from nothing. My husband and I were the third family to move in." Something vulnerable flickered across her face. "After he died, the neighborhood became everything to me. Perhaps I've become overzealous in protecting it." It wasn't quite an admission, but it was the closest thing to humanity Mark had seen from her. He nodded acknowledgement. "I understand caring deeply about your home," he said. "That's something we have in common." Diane seemed surprised by this response. She opened her mouth as if to say something more, then apparently thought better of it. With a curt nod, she turned toward the door. "Ms. Holloway," Mark called as she reached for the handle. She paused, not turning. "The block party next Saturday. You're welcome to come. It's not an HOA event, just neighbors getting together." Now she did turn, her expression unreadable. "I doubt I'd be welcome." "It's not about being welcome or unwelcome," Mark said quietly. "It's about being neighbors. That's all any of us are trying to do here." Diane studied him for a long moment, then opened the door without responding. As she walked down his front path, her posture was as rigid as ever, but something had shifted. Not enough for reconciliation, perhaps, but enough to suggest that beneath the Karen exterior was a woman who might someday remember how to simply be a neighbor again. Mark closed the door gently and returned to his coffee, smiling to himself. Outside, the summer sun sparkled on his pool water, undisturbed and peaceful at last. The August sun beat down on Maple Street as Mark filled the last cooler with ice. 6 weeks had passed since his confrontation with Diane, and the neighborhood had settled into a new rhythm. Helen had won the special election for HOA vice president by a landslide, immediately implementing what she called her good neighbor policy, a commitment to communication before confrontation. Today marked the second monthly block party for the non-HOA section of Maple Street, but with an important difference. Residents from throughout Oak Ridge had been invited, HOA members and non-members alike. "Need any help with that?" asked Officer Lisa Washington, now just Lisa, to Mark as she approached with a tray of homemade lemonade. "Just finished," Mark replied, straightening up. "Thanks for coming early. Wouldn't miss it," she said with a smile. "Besides, Ellis said you're firing up the pool for the kids later. Someone needs to make sure the lifeguard has proper supervision." Mark laughed. When Ellis had suggested opening Mark's backyard to the neighborhood children for supervised swimming, he'd initially hesitated. But after getting proper insurance coverage and posting clear rules, he found unexpected joy in sharing his private oasis with families who couldn't afford the crowded community pool across town. "How many are we expecting today?" Lisa asked, setting down her tray. "Last count was around 40, Mark replied, more than double last month." They both knew why. The bridge building between Idaho and non-Idaho residents had gained momentum, with Gerald Henderson himself publicly acknowledging that the division had been unnecessary and counterproductive. As if summoned by their thoughts, Gerald's car pulled up to the curb. He emerged with a large platter covered in foil, followed by his wife and teenage son. "Mark," he called cheerfully. "I brought my famous ribs. Hope that's okay." "More than okay," Mark assured him, taking the heavy platter. "Thanks for coming." Gerald lowered his voice. "Just so you know, I saw Diane earlier today. She was debating whether to come." Mark nodded, unsurprised. He hadn't expected Diane to accept his invitation, but he felt it important to extend it nonetheless. Whatever she decides is fine. Within an hour, the street was transformed. Tables lined the sidewalks laden with potluck dishes. Children darted between yards playing an elaborate game of tag. Ellis had set up his vintage record player on his porch, filling the air with classic rock. The invisible barrier that had once divided Maple Street from the rest of Oak Ridge seemed to have dissolved in the summer heat. Mark was flipping burgers on his grill when Helen approached with a stranger, a young woman with dark curly hair and Diane's unmistakable nose and chin. "Mark, this is Stephanie Holloway, Diane's daughter," Helen introduced. "She's visiting from Chicago." "Nice to meet you," Mark said, offering his hand. "I didn't know Diane had family in town." "Just for the weekend," Stephanie replied, shaking his hand firmly. "I heard there was quite a situation with my mother and your pool." Mark chose his words carefully. "We had a misunderstanding that's been resolved." Stephanie smiled ruefully. "That's a diplomatic way of putting it. Mom has struggled since Dad died. The Asia way became her way of maintaining control when everything else felt chaotic." "I can understand that," Mark said, and found that he genuinely did. "She probably won't make it today," Stephanie continued. "But she mentioned your invitation. It meant something to her, even if she can't admit it." Before Mark could respond, a collective cheer went up from the direction of Mark's backyard. The first group of children had discovered that the pool was ready, complete with the floating toys Mark had purchased specially for the occasion. "Duty calls," Mark said, handing the spatula to Helen. "Mind the burgers?" As he made his way through the crowd toward his yard, accepting handshakes and thanks from neighbors both familiar and new, Mark caught sight of a familiar geometric blonde haircut at the periphery of the gathering. Diane stood beside a tree, watching the festivities with an unreadable expression, neither approaching nor retreating. Mark raised a hand in acknowledgement. After a moment's hesitation, Diane returned the gesture with a small, tight nod. It wasn't friendship. It might never be. But it was acknowledgement of boundaries respected, of lessons learned, of the simple fact that sometimes the best way to be part of a community was to allow others their space within it. Later, as twilight settled over Maple Street and the children reluctantly emerged from the pool wrapped in towels, Mark found himself sitting on his front steps beside Ellis, watching fireflies begin to dot the gathering darkness. "Not bad for a guy who just wanted to swim in peace," Ellis remarked, raising his beer bottle in a toast. Mark clinked his bottle against his neighbor's. "Not bad at all." Across the street, Gerald and several other former HOA hardliners were deep in conversation with residents from Mark's block, gesturing animatedly as they discussed plans for a joint neighborhood watch program. Lisa was demonstrating proper grilling technique to a cluster of admiring teenagers. Somewhere in the background, Stephanie's laugh rang out, surprisingly similar to what her mother's might sound like if Deanne ever truly relaxed. And at the very edge of the gathering, maintaining her distance but present nonetheless, Diane Holloway watched it all unfold. The community she tried to control through rules and regulations flourishing instead through simple connection. The irony wasn't lost on Mark. His pool, which Diane had viewed as a threat to her ordered world, had become the catalyst not for division, but for the very cohesion she had always claimed to want. Not through enforcement or control, but through openness and mutual respect. As the stars emerged overhead and neighbors lingered in the cooling evening air, Mark felt something settle within him, a sense of belonging he hadn't experienced since before his divorce. He had come to Oak Ridge seeking solitude and healing. He had found something better, A community where even the most difficult boundaries could be navigated with patience and persistence. And yes, occasionally with a firm reminder that some things, like a man's backyard pool, were nobody's business but his own. The end.